Good afternoon. My name is Eric Peterson. I'm the Operations Project Manager for the Willamette Valley and Rogue Basin projects. And today I'm here to talk with you about the water year 2022, what conditions look like, what we can think about moving forward. And I'm going to share my screen here. I've got a brief presentation. I lead the team of people who operate and maintain facilities in the Willamette and Rogue Basins and provide stewardship to the land and water and cultural resources there as well. I'm glad you're here to join us today. I'm re-recording the introduction to this as we missed a bit of the recording, had some technical problems. Today's agenda, we'll talk a little bit about the system, what it is, why we're here. We'll look at hydrologic conditions right now and ahead. And we'll talk a little bit about how we got here this water year, looking back at the weather and looking forward at the climate. We'll look at specific model runs and we'll compare these model runs from this year to past, present, and future. And then we'll have time for questions and answers as well. I want to mention special thanks to Kevin McAllister and Selena Hart in the Portland District for preparing most of this information, and also for Dan Van Dyke with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, who also provided a lot of data to support today's conversation. All right, the Rogue River Basin is in Southwest Oregon. Most of you, I'm sure all of you know. We have two control points for our two facilities there. We've got Applegate Dam and Lost Creek or Jess Dam, and control points at Agnes for both temperature and flow volume, and for flow volume at Grants Pass. The Rogue Basin projects were authorized primarily for flood risk management, fisheries enhancement, irrigation, and water supply, and secondarily, collaterally, they provide some hydropower benefits as well as water quality and recreation benefits. The recreation benefits provided really happen on Corps of Engineers lands and are reservoir-based or immediately downstream and adjacent to the dams and reservoirs. Our flood risk management mission is pretty straightforward. This chart gives you kind of an indication of what we do and why we try to do it. In the late spring, think about where we are now, using the bottom axis as months of the year and the vertical axis as elevation above sea level. And at the beginning of May, we're really heading into our conservation season, where we've stored up water through the spring as much as we could to get to our full maximum conservation pool. And then we use this water that's conserved for downstream purposes during the summer months. In the summer months at Applegate and Lost Creek, what we provide is water principally for habitat, fish habitat, as well as some water supply and irrigation. In the fall, beginning in September, we deliberately draw down the reservoirs to make room for temporal storage in the winter months when we're down at the minimum conservation pool or below that, in order to take the peaks off of the big inflow events that happen. And for the last 10 or 20 years, we've had very few of those. The last largest event was in April of 2019, and it was not a super significant event for the Rogue Basin. All right, so we use water stored for fish, and then we use water in ways that facilitate safe operations. So during the summer months, there are a number of concerns related to both fish health, adult fish health, and red health, juvenile health, and then the way we manage water is important for ramping and timing. We also have the Coal Rivers hatchery immediately downstream of Lost Creek, and we manage for the species listed there. So in terms of managing water, the priorities for fisheries include improving on avoiding pre-spawn mortality among spring Chinook and fall Chinook, avoiding dewatering, loss of young salmon in the spring, and early emergence of spring Chinook in the spring, as well as increasing survival rates for juvenile salmon in the summer months when temperature can be a real factor there as well. For 2022, we're still in a protracted drought. The precipitation for 2022 is about 66% of what could be in an average year. And we got to recognize, because this has been a protracted drought, hydrology behaves a little differently on the landscape. So the ground tends to soak up water quite a bit more, and we get a little less runoff when we do get precip events. As you'll see in a moment, we had a very, very dry January, February, and March, and April really kind of saved us from a much more difficult water year. We had an uptick last month in the snow water equivalent, but it's still below the median. And for the system, our natural water yield is about 72% of normal or average, which is a little bit better than last year, because last year was about 59%. Some other factors for this year, where we started, Lost Creek minimum outflows since September were steady and dropped to a historic low in mid-March of about 650 CFS, and I'll show you that. We had carryover storage applied to the extent of about 93,000 acre feet last year, so we started this water year in quite a deficit. We got an approval for a deviation in January to capture some of the flow event that happened at Applegate, and that means we went above the water control diagram, or above our risk threshold, for just a little while to be able to capture about 3,300 acre feet of water there. So this is just a snapshot of the system yesterday. Our Teacup diagram available to everybody online. If you use this, all right. I'm getting some injects from my staff saying my presentation is, notes are showing. I'm sorry about that. I'm not going to manage that right now. So we'll just keep going. Creek, I'm sorry, Galesville and Emigrant belong to both Douglas County and VOR, but they're part of our overall flood risk management strategy, and we show them here as well because they contribute to the system. Current conditions, Lost Creek, we're down about 30%, Applegate down about 43%, the system is down about 32%. Talk a little bit about precipitation. You can see from the beginning of the water year, October 1st to May 1st, Southern Oregon, pretty obvious we've been dry. As you look month to month, January was dry, February was drier, March also pretty dry, and then in April, what we all know is we got a little bit more precipitation in April, and it helped us out quite a bit. In terms of snow water equivalent, there's a whole lot of variability around the system. You can see that. You can see that we peaked really in late April, but still the snow water equivalent is below median this year. The fact that we peaked late is really just indicative that this water in the system is going to help us a little bit longer, maintain base flow a little later in the summer. This slide shows drought conditions, April 27th last year and April 26th this year. We're in tougher shape this year than we were last year in southern, central, and eastern Oregon. About the only place that really was doing any better this year was northwest Oregon, kind of the Portland area up to the Columbia River and to the coast. Longer term forecast, and these are kind of subjective, as everybody knows, but it looks like May is going to be cooler and drier. So temperature is going to be a little bit cooler, and precip's going to be a little bit below what we would expect under equal chance scenarios. What's good about this is May is typically a fairly dry month anyway, and so deviating a little bit from an ordinarily drier time period has less consequence. The fact that the temperature is going to be cooler is likely going to help us a little bit in that we're less likely to have the snowpack come off quickly and less likely to have to augment flow for temperatures downstream, or at least delay that augmentation a little bit. This shows what would flow naturally at Grants Pass without the system in place. So these are the natural volume forecasts. As you can see, the slide on the right shows a pretty good uptick in April and a leveling off in the first couple of days of this month, which represent a real positive change. Also shows the April to September timeframe, 59% last year, 72% this year. So again, for this conservation season, we expect a challenging year, but conditions improved. We were looking at model runs maybe three weeks to a month ago, and the elevation was, forecast was around 1830. Now we're expecting to hit 1850 at Lost Creek. We are pursuing a cautious approach due to the drought that we're in. Our authorities for fish tend to support other downstream benefits like water quality, water supply, recreation, economic development downstream. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that we'll see those benefits realized. The scheduled releases are just under 240,000 acre feet. That'll take Lost Creek to around 1,792 plus or minus feet later this summer. And we will use about 50,000 acre feet of carryover storage. That's at least what we expect at this point. For fish, the priorities are augmenting for May to June priorities, followed by priorities in late August, and then followed by July and early August priorities, depending on water availability. And again, the near-term forecast is cool, and the local flows remain a little bit higher. So here's a hydrograph of Lost Creek. You can see the blue line represents the actual. The red line represents our risk tolerance, or our water control diagram. You can see that we were well below our water control diagram, or rule curve, for the whole year. The spiked green line at the bottom of the screen represents inflows, and the blue line represents our outflows from William Jess Dam or Lost Creek Reservoir. And you can see back in September, we cut the flows mid-September and really sustained almost minimum outflows through the winter months. And then we dropped down to conserve water in mid-March, and that's where we are right now in May. We had some inflows in January, not a whole lot again until March, and then again in April. But it's the steady flows in April, March and April, that have really kind of helped us out a little bit. Here's what we expect this red dashed line is the 50% non-exceedance curve for our forecast. And if you look at where we are right now, it's where the solid line ends, beginning of May. We're going to end up probably at some point later in the summer a little bit better off from a reservoir storage standpoint than where we were in 2021, for example, and certainly better than we were also in a couple of other water years noted there. But still a pretty tough water year, dry year, and part of it has to do with starting in this deficit where we dropped down to about 1770 back in late fall. Applegate looks a little bit better. Just looking again, we started below water control diagram last fall, and went below the minimum conservation pool this winter a little bit because it was pretty dry in October, November. We had a spike of inflow in January, and we sought a deviation so that we could capture some of that inflow and stay above the water control diagram. We did that. We captured about 3,300 acre feet, not a lot, but a little bit. And we've been climbing steadily because from really early February on, we've been pushing minimum flows out of Applegate. Here's the model forecast for Applegate for the remaining water year. You can see the dashed red line is our 50% non-exceedance curve. And again, it looks like we're going to have a better water year there than we did in 21 or 92, and certainly better than 2001. So in summary, this has been a tough water year, not as bad as it could have been or what we were thinking it would be back in maybe February and March. Real fortunate for the April events, but remaining cautious. I'll say that models are indicators. As you saw, there was a range of variability as to what might happen, depending on what precip we get coming in and what we need to use from storage to augment flows. They're imperfect, but they are predictive. We would like to start 2023 in a better position with respect to carryover storage. That matters if we head into another drought. We do seem to be in a protracted drought pattern. However, we all know only hindsight is 2020. Our flood risk management mission always prevents us from storing excessively in the winter months, and there's very little opportunity this winter anyway. Even if we wanted to capture every drop we could, essentially we did that at Lost Creek. Adaptive management is how we operate. Both temperature and flow volume matter for fish, and as conditions change, if they do, we'll change accordingly and work with our partners to do so. I'll say, in deficit years, nobody gets everything they want, but we try to do what we can to optimize what we have based on the authorities that we have in our authorizing legislation. All right. That said, I have time for questions, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I apologize that you all ended up seeing my notes. Most of the time I work WebEx pretty good. Today, I goofed a little bit, and I apologize for that. If there are questions out there, if we could use the chat to ask the questions, that would be great. And there appears not to be questions. Here we go. Do I expect the jet boat companies on the road to have a full season? I can't tell you that at this point in time. I know that from my vantage point, we're looking a little bit better now than we were a little earlier, but so much of availability and flexibility around the jet boats really has to do with what injects we have with respect to weather and temperature and what fish need downstream. Well, I gave the high expectation for Lost Creek. What's the expected high elevation of Applegate? Let me scroll back just a little bit. Applegate, in rough terms, looks like about 1960 at the beginning of late June, early July. And number of questions coming in. Thanks for those. I'll work through them. Flow and temp requirements. I'm going to ask probably first Dan Van Dyke with ODFW to be able to speak to this. Dan, I'll unmute you here. Dan, can you speak a little bit to the flow and temp requirements for fish?
Sure. Just very briefly, so the fish pattern for fish conservation with the augmentation releases from Lost Creek are in 3 priorities in the summer. May and June, it's all about protecting and minimizing the risk of pre-spawning mortality in spring Chinook that are migrating upriver as we speak. Second priority is doing the same for fall Chinook in late August, and the third priority is releases to benefit juvenile steelhead production in the river in the summer. So in May and June with spring Chinook, and this is all based on decades of research that was funded by the Corps to help learn how to utilize Lost Creek in the most effective way possible. Every 2-week period in May and June, we have temperature metrics at the Agnes gauge on the lower river. And if water temperatures are approaching that metric, we have a flow target that we want to meet, or at least be close to minimize that risk of a disease outbreak. I don't have that easily at hand to show right now, but every 2-week period, so the first half of May, there's a temperature criterion. Second half of May, it's a little bit higher. First 2 weeks of June, it's a little bit higher. Last 2 weeks of June, a little bit higher again. But we have flow targets that we try and meet when those lower river temperatures are starting to really increase, and that's typically in hot weather. And it's all about trying to keep a disease outbreak from happening. With fall Chinook, I'll jump to our second priority. There, fall Chinook, we think are actually evolved to deal with lower flows and warmer river temperatures. We don't have a temperature metric to help protect fall Chinook. We simply want the flow down at Agnes from like roughly August 10th through early September. To protect fall Chinook, we want flows at Agnes to be in the 2,000 to 2,300 CFS range. Research has found that flows in that range will minimize pre-spawning mortality in fall Chinook. Moving then backwards to our third priority for fish, in July, the absolute minimum is we want the flows at Grants Pass to be at least 1,000 CFS to keep juvenile fish from dying from disease outbreaks, which we have seen in the Rogue at times in the past. And that's the minimum. I hope that helps, Eric.
I think it does, Dan. I know we have some other fisheries questions here, so we can either lean on your support or Mr. Taylor's. Question came in. It looks like, are any of the reservoirs managed for recreation and angling, or are those elements taken into consideration in management? Really, the authorities that we have with respect to water are really all about flood risk management in the wintertime and fisheries, water supply, irrigation, and water quality during the conservation season. The authorities we have for recreation really are around building facilities for reservoir-based recreation and providing support so that people have a safe visit to the reservoir. And so that's what we do. I guess in the context of protracted drought, I have seen us both exclusively and in partnership with others work on building more resilience with respect to facilities so that they can be used under a broader range of circumstances. And certainly that makes sense to temper people's expectations, one, and adapt facilities to accommodate use, two. But no, we don't hold water back for reservoir recreation, nor do we release water for downstream recreation. We release for other purposes. I see that, thank you, Selena, for answering one of the questions online there, pointing someone to the a graphic. Are there predictions for angling restrictions because of drought conditions such as hours limitation? That's one really for ODFW to speak to. That's outside of my wheelhouse. Dan, not sure if you're able to speak to that one as well.
Certainly, yeah. For ODFW, we're already well into planning stages for potential actions we might take during this extreme drought year. Last year, we did implement some restrictions on angling hours to protect sensitive fish and native fish, and that'll be based on, again, weather that we might see this year, as well as flows and more importantly, river temperatures we might see. So conditions are cool, unusually cool. We're getting a fair amount of precipitation right now, so nothing is planned at this time, but that's something ODFW is going to be monitoring and reacting and adapting as conditions merit. The reservoirs will stay open for fishing. There's no restrictions in the reservoir fisheries typically implemented by ODFW in our angling regulation management. Whether we change bag limits or anything like that at some of the other reservoirs, like the irrigation district reservoirs, that remains to be seen. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Got another question here about expectations around water. Will it be sufficient to protect all fish species and ages of fish? That's probably another one for you, Dan. Sorry, loading you up today.
No problem. I do want to add that a month ago, so we coordinate with the Corps and Oregon Water Resources on a weekly call to help guide reservoir management here in the Rogue and to help the Corps meet its fishery work. Those calls were very depressing late March, early April. At that time, if the reservoir filling had come to what it looked like back then, we were looking at a high likelihood of not being able to meet our second and third priorities for fish protection. So ODFW was potentially looking at a significant loss of adult fall Chinook on their migration upstream. Again, due to disease outbreaks, due to hot weather, low flows, and a lot of fish that results in disease. Right now, I can just say I'm we think releases are going to be enough to meet our priorities. It just depends on the weather that we might see in this continuing drought. We do not want to see a repeat of that heat dome from last July. That's what I've got.
Thank you. Question from Josh Bennett. What are our expected output flows with dates from the dam from now through September? I'll caveat that by saying it, certainly subject to change based on conditions and based on what we need to do to adapt. But I'll throw that one over to Kevin McAllister if he's able to speak to it. If not, I know we've got other folks who can speak to it. Kevin, are you able to talk to that one, at least in general terms?
Yeah. So, like you said, a lot of it's going to be subject to change, but the current conditions right now are probably going to allow for higher than what we had initially. I don't have the actual the flows pulled up right now. I certainly could. While I'm pulling that up, I saw a couple other questions that are kind of on the modeling side of things in regards to the 5% and the 95%. Not really necessarily sure what your specific question is, but how we compare to last year to this year, we still are substantially lower in the project right now. However, at this point last year, we were already increasing releases to start augmenting for temperatures downstream. I don't know if you guys remember, but at the end of April last year, we had a pretty big heat wave and we had to start releasing water early on. And that went all the way into May, into June, as it normally does, but it was substantially earlier last year. And then when you talk about the 95% versus the 5%, so really all that's saying is that we did a series of model runs, which is about 31 years, and 95% of those runs were above that line as a result. And then for the 95%, that means that it's basically the opposite. So all but 5% were in between or were below that. And that's what that's referring to. And then in reference to last year, as you can see, we had already basically peaked last year and we were starting to increase releases out of the project. Whereas this year, I think we're gonna have a much more of a broad peak, as you can see from that, where we're gonna probably peak somewhere around mid-May is what it's looking like right now. And I would almost, I don't know, if you look at the trajectory of where we currently are with live data, we're actually leading towards the higher end of where the traces are pointing towards. That's also because we started building snowpack much later than any time I've ever seen last several years in April. So I think that's going to also push things out as far as when we actually start drafting the project down. And then, does that answer your questions about the 5% versus 95% and last year? I think it was Steve.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then what was the other one that was specific to modeling? Maybe that was the only one. The other one was the, let's see, what is allowed minimum release, Lost Creek? So the allowed minimum release from Lost Creek is actually 500 CFS during a flood event. And then beyond that, generally it's 700 CFS, which is generally driven by the conditions downstream of the project or directly downstream of the project. If we start reducing releases below there, we can see some significant impacts to the species right downstream from the project. And then what else? Oh, okay, cool. And I'm trying to think if there was anything. Oh, rule curve question. Those are always a fun question to talk about, rule curves. So it is true that climate change is a thing and it's noticeable and that things are going on right now, but all of the most recent studies in regards to rule curve actually point to saying that we should actually be filling later, because the variability of these flood events and extreme weather conditions are actually increasing. as things change, which implies, and as the project's number one authority, is flood risk management. So if you start filling a project sooner, but you have the potential for more frequent flood events, you're taking on a significant amount of risk that is not necessarily, I guess, that's just not something that we're willing to take on. They definitely are looked at though on a regular basis though, and we do work in bands. And as Eric alluded to, we did the deviation this year with Applegate, where we actually held the project above wheel curve for about a month. So while they're not adjusting the actual official wheel curves, we are adapting our processes to try to make up for those years like this where we have significant droughts. And then let's see, I'm almost to the flow data. It's
okay.
Yeah, go ahead. You can touch on that one.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to add, we did do the deviation at Applegate to adapt to the drier conditions, seeing that the forecast was not showing any flood risk, so we did do a deviation. We have some funding to update water control manuals, and we do plan on looking at ways that we could possibly manage to improve refill without impacting flood risk management. So we're looking at things. It will take some time, but we are looking at ways that we can adjust management based on improved forecasting capabilities and just using that science behind it.
All right.
Man.
Kevin, do you have you pulled up flow data?
Yeah, I pulled it up. It's hard to answer questions and surf your computer at the same time, I realize. So this is in general so generally it creates a band of releases, but for this year we actually ended up, I just kept it the same for all the different model runs, just because there's no chance of reaching, there was nothing within the band of probability that would actually have us getting to full. So we were able just to look at the minimum flow releases that way. So as you can see, the most recent one has us bumping up to 1,000. And that was just kind of our first guess at the beginning of May, which obviously hasn't happened yet because we've been maintaining those cooler temperatures, and we've actually seen a lot of local contribution from streams down, from the streams down below. So we've been saving water here. And then as we get into mid-May, as we normally do, we're bumping releases up, which was right around 1850 as the spring Chinooks start migrating. And then we expect to see a climb in temperatures. And then as our temperature targets go up, but our temperatures in the system go up as well, we start increasing releases again right around mid-May into June of 2650. And then once this is kind of the hot spot, which is between, mid to late May into mid-June. And then we start cutting back releases again as we get into July. And as of right now, we have about 1,200 out of the project through most of July. And then at the beginning of August, we bumped releases up to 1,300. And then even further in the beginning of, or not really the mid, but about the 11th of August, where we normally do our ramp up, is 1,750. Or actually, it's usually a little bit higher than that. But so that's just the general shape of it right now. Obviously, it's subject to change as we are seeing, very optimistic conditions in the system. Because obviously, we would like to be able to release more water than this, as it'll improve fisheries conditions downstream dramatically. We don't ever want to see flows that low if we don't have to conserve water.
I see that Glenn asked a question around authority for the deviation above the water control diagram. And Selena, thank you for answering that. We just go to the next higher office above our office for temporary deviations. Are there other questions out there? All right. In the absence of questions, I just want to thank everybody for committing their time. Kevin, Selena, Dan, Van Dyke, thank you for supporting the data that fed this presentation. Thank you all for joining us and for the good questions today. Maybe this is something we can do a little later in the season to provide an update. It's fairly low wear and tear. And yeah, just want to thank you all. Have a good afternoon. Let's hope for cool weather and a little bit more rain before summer hits. Okay? Thanks so much.